Thank you so much. Welcome, everybody. It's a great pleasure to have you all with us. We have participants from around the globe today, and I thank you very much for being with us. My name is FREDERICK. I am the Assistant Dean of Academic Design and Innovation at UC Berkeley Global, and I have the great privilege of co-moderating this panel event with my colleague, Professor Jean-Michel Rajkovic of the CNAM.
Yeah, so my name is Jean-Michel Rajkovic. I'm a chair marketing professor at CNAM, and I'm also co-president of the French Marketing Association. We have a partnership between CNAM, Conservatoire National des Arts et Métiers, and Berkeley Extension, and we are trying to develop the link between our MBA and the programs, the study track that we are promoting around about project management at Berkeley. We were due to be in Berkeley in a few weeks, but because of the COVID, we postponed our international travels, and we decided to create, to keep on having a link and to create this event series. The first one and the second one took place during the COVID, during the lockdown, and the first title were about marketing. The second one was around chaos management, and the third one after the lockdown in France was about strategy. So this event is number 4, and I will leave Frederick to present the content of this event about digital transformation, AI, and virtual workforce. Frederick?
Yes, thank you very much. So today we have the great opportunity to gain insights from global thought leaders on how to manage this digital transformation out of the crisis. And I really want to thank our amazing panelists for having taken the opportunity to be with us, having taken the time to be with us today. So we have Jill Finlayson, the Director of Women in Technology Initiative at the University of California. We have Philippe Dumais, adjunct faculty at the CNAM and Vice President of Operational Excellence at Trivium Packaging. We have Michael Wu, Chief AI Strategist at PROS, and HERVE BUISSON, Senior Advisor in Innovation and Technologies at VEOLIA Water Technologies. We will let you introduce yourselves to the audience with a few individual questions at the beginning, and after that, we plan to open the discussion to everyone to address these very interesting questions about how we manage this digital transformation out of the crisis. To introduce the topic more broadly speaking is we were wondering how we can help managers take these opportunities that have arisen through the crisis, through the shelter in place or confinement, how it is called in France, and see how we can use these opportunities that we were forced into, this way of working that we were forced into due to the crisis, to actually lead our companies better out of into this new normal. To the audience, please feel free to share your questions at any time in the Q&A box. We have a team of moderators that will structure those questions so that the panel can address them in person, in live, as the questions come up. And we will try, Jean-Michel and myself, to weave them into the discussion while we have the discussion with you. So thank you very much. I will let Jean-Michel kick off the introduction of our first panelist.
So maybe we go for presentation, and maybe we start with Jill.
Thank you. Yes, my name is Jill Finlayson, and I'm the director of the Women in Tech Initiative at the University of California. And our goal is to increase the participation, persistence, and advancement of women in STEM fields. And it's part of CITRIS, which is the Center for IT Research in the Interest of Society. And it's also co-funded by the College of Engineering, because we want to work together to not only make academics more equitable, but the workplaces that the students go into more equitable and fair. My background, I've worked with a lot of startups and global technology companies, and in particular, I also mentor with Tech Women, which is a State Department program around how we can help more women come into STEM and support them around the globe. So very excited to be here today. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Jill. The next panelist will be Philippe. Philippe?
Good evening, everyone. So my name is Philippe Dumais. as was said, I'm adjunct faculty at the CNAM in Paris. I'm lecturing on digital transformation. Outside of that, I'm a VP of Operational Excellence at Tribune Packaging. My background is both from consulting, from McKinsey, and from the industry, having all the various general director positions in 2 companies, Alstom being a rolling stock manufacturer, and Impress Packaging some time ago.
Thank you, Philip. The next one will be Michael.
Hi, everyone. I'm Michael Wu. I'm the Chief AI Strategist at Pros. And Pros is a company that helps other companies monetize more efficiently through pricing and sales optimization using artificial intelligence and machine learning. And I'm very fortunate to actually look after all the magic that makes all this work, which is AI and machine learning. And I'm very happy to be part of this distinguished panel.
Thank you, Michael. And live from Normandy, I guess, we do have HERVE. HERVE,
yes, hi. Yes, so HERVE BUISSON, I work with VEOLIA as Senior Advisor for Innovation. VEOLIA is the world leader in environmental management. So basically, we deal with large physical systems, your water treatment plants, your wastewater treatment plants, which use a lot of people. So we have a lot of people that were impacted by, we discussed that by the confinement, by COVID. But at the same time, you'll see how these large systems have, we are thinking, how can they be more resilient after COVID? And indeed, I am in Normandy right now, very close to the D-Day landing beaches, where, 6th of June, many years ago, Europe was retaken basically from the Nazis.
Thank you, Hervé. So it's one more way to make links between Europe and the States. We can, at this stage, jump into our discussion, and I will raise the first question for Jill. Jill, more or less, we are going out of the lockdown. What did we learn with respect to remote work and to with virtual teams management?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's been really interesting because one thing that we've seen is, this has been an opportunity for change where, change is often difficult in the past, but we've been forced into this. And what we've discovered is that knowledge workers actually prefer to work from home if they can. Here at Cal, they actually did a survey. Only 10% want to come back full time. 47% want to be remote at least 3 days a week. So this is a pretty significant change. And there's a lot of, I think, factors that go into that. No commute, time savings, flexibility, even casual dress. You see a lot of memes about that. And then there's the other win, which is, saving carbon and reducing commutes, really having a positive effect on the environment. There's been one other thing, which I think is interesting, sort of the humanizing aspect. As you see in this Zoom call, all our heads are the same size. We all have a seat at the table. And if people walk into the room, you see people's family or pets or children. And this has been sort of a leveling and humanizing element. But it didn't come without a cost. So the cost being that we experienced some pretty significant short-term productivity, performance challenges as people were drawn into other difficult and stressful and anxiety-producing events. And these have a disproportionate impact on women and people of color, especially women of color and single parents. Basically, this whole double shift, which we know women have a disproportionate of childcare, elder care, and home care, which really was exacerbated by the COVID situation. So women doing 70% of the childcare during the workday. And we see this in the academic environment in that the publishing by women academics actually plummeted while the publishing by male academics went up 50%. So we see the impacts of this that it has on people's productivity. We also saw a huge number of layoffs, of course. And with this, we saw a loss of diversity gains because a lot of times it's last hired, first fired. And a lot of the people who have been brought into the workforce have been let go. And that has had a really disproportionate impact on people of color and younger people entering the workforce. And then we also have the issue of equitable participation, right? We want everybody to be able to work from home, but do they have high-speed internet at home? Do they even have a quiet quiet room where they can focus and do things. And for students, we found they were in different time zones because they went home, and that became challenging to access classes. So, my kind of takeaway on that is that our near-term learnings from this experience are that only those who need to return to work should return to work. We have issues with social distancing, only one person riding in an elevator, single direction stairwells. And so some people have location-specific work and they have to come to work. So how do we protect them? Well, we have to exclude those that are location independent. The second thing I would say we learned is that you have to level the playing field. So given all those concerns that I had about disproportionate impacts, how do we make sure people have the tools to work remotely and, equitably? How do we support workers to create work-life boundaries when work and life are in the same space? How do we extend childcare benefits and leave options for people who have elders or other concerns that they're dealing with? And how do we take the equity lens into consideration when we are doing layoffs or when we're bringing people back? And all of this comes to my third key point, which is that we have to lead with integrity. That means empathy, flexibility, being able to provide resources to managers so that they can be more effective, right, in this new environment. Because, microaggressions don't stop because you're in a Zoom meeting. Women still get talked over, interrupted, and those sort of things. So we need to provide more training for our managers. And then also for the staff, right, enable employee resource groups to do activities and support employees. And that ties to the last thing, which is mental health, right? How do we help people deal with their mental health and anxiety and stress issues? That becomes actually an obligation of the workplace. And I'll share in the Slack, our Center for Equity, Gender, and Leadership at UC Berkeley has published a dual careers playbook because 62% of couples are both working full time, and that has impacts on how employers look at their employees, especially in this climate of remote and virtual employees.
It's fascinating. Thank you so much. The difference between efficiency and effectiveness that you're drawing out here is really very interesting from the perspective in the shift of mindset that managers and leadership really need to consider and probably will have to go through. I wanted to ask Philippe, with kind of the same background of the idea of effectiveness, efficiency, what did we learn with respect to running operations in this time where a lot of things were done remotely, or at least if it was in-person operations, there was need for social distancing? What did we learn there?
Well, first of all, some general comments on the same line as Jill said. For people for whom the work can be digitized, we've learned to be more efficient, to be more coordinated. Meetings are better prepared, people more common time. There's a better use of the digital tools, a massive adoption on that. But that's not the case for everyone. So when you come to operations and managing factories, obviously, that creates a lot of constraint and much more caution in terms of protecting our workforce, implementing the right rules of social distancing, food protection, testing people, limiting contacts between people working from the offices and people working on the floor. And that has really redefined the way people interact. We have seen in some factories headset being bought so that people could still communicate while in a very noisy environment. So all these elements are really new. What it brings, it brings some upside in terms of being focused, being right on the task. As Jill said, there's some drawbacks of that. And beyond the equality question, I think it raises the question that short term, we are much better in terms of carrying on our current processes. But the question is, what about the medium and long term? Because in terms of being creative, constructing some strategy, some plan, we all realize that with the digital tools that we have today, we can be much more limited. So it's really that trade-off between that short-term productivity, efficiency gain versus preparing for the future.
What is really impressive is that we start having the point of view from the US and jumping to Europe. And actually, it's an ongoing discussion because the comments we are making are not that far away from each other. And I don't. We jump into very close conclusion on many topics about work organization, about balance between private and job situation and so on. And of course, all the topics about technology and so on are key. They are in the middle of our discussion, and we are very quickly using and learning how to use those new technology. My next question will be for Michael, because AI was already the winner before COVID, and just like there is kind of an acceleration, a digital boost, which is impacting our daily life, AI will have a brighter future, isn't it, Michael? What is the impact on your side, from your point of view?
Sure. Certainly, I think the COVID, the lockdown, created a huge need for digital transformation. I think that is actually the first step. And with respect to, I would say, integrating AI into different corporation or different operations within the company, it really depends on where the company is, on this kind of a maturity curve of AI adoption. So there is a maturity curve, and it's I would say I would look at it in more like 6 different phases. Okay, maybe 5, but the last one is really when everything is working with AI. So let's try to go through them quickly. I don't want to take too much time, but first one is really, I would just say, the digitization of work, right? Basically, that's just getting the data, right? If you digitize the work, then you would have the data to train the AI to mimic how we work, right? So the first step is what we call. It's also the first step of digital transformation. It's the digitization, right? So that's getting the data. And once you have the data, then basically you can train some AI model to essentially help you automate certain tasks. Basically, if I know that every time I come into the office, I always, turn on my light or my laptop, and the first thing I do is to check email. If you have all those data, then you could just automate it, write a script to automate it, right? So every time, use an IoT device to a motion detector, when you come in the door, turn on the light, turn on the laptop, start up your email program. So these are what we call the second phase, where you start to exchange data for automation, right? First step is to digitization of work. Second phase is you start to exchange this data for automation, right? Now, once these AI is able to start to automate some aspects of your work, right? These models are usually not, I would say, very good. They can't perform at a human level, right? So then the next phase would be what we call, teaching the AI to refine its model of how we work. Okay, so essentially, we are basically kind of like the supervisor of this AI, right? Where every time you automate something, we will come, okay, great, you did a good job here, and then we are there to as a kind of a reviewer, right? The AI will say, in this situation, I recommend you to do this, right? And then you will say, yes, that's right, go ahead and do it, or no, this I wouldn't do it, and then you take over, you do it, and then while you are doing this, right, the AI actually collects data, because now you have digitization of work already, right? So it collects the data so that it takes these data to refine the model. Okay, so the third phase is basically teaching the AI to refine the model, right? And if you do this long enough, basically, this AI will eventually become really, really good. It could basically automate a huge part of your work, right? I mean, so what do what happens then? Basically, what happens then is basically we call this a full, the fourth phase is essentially the full AI automation, right? So a lot of people would say, well, if AI is automating all our work, then what do we do? So I mean, valid question, but I would say that it is no different than when we have trained our intern to do our work, right? Basically, our job shift, right? We become managers, right? If we train a new employee, we have someone reporting to us. We train them to essentially mimic our work, right? And then once they are good enough to do our work, then we become managers. We take on more responsibility, right? The nature of our work, the nature of our job changes, but I would say that we move into something more strategic and more important, right? So this is the fourth phase. Basically, we have full AI automation and job shift. People move on to something more important. So these are more, I would say, the first four phases is more, I would say, the internal operation within the company, right? I think that the fifth phase basically starts to what we call delivering the last mile of this AI automation, okay? And that really has to do with robotic and these machineries, and that's because like I think AI and digital transformation is great, but there are a lot of things we can't do digitally. I mean, you can't eat a meal digitally, right? You could surf on the web and configure and buy your product, right? But you can't always. Not every single product can be downloaded to your laptop, right? A lot of these products need to be delivered physically, right? A lot of service need to be performed by humans, right? So how do you deliver that last mile, right? Basically, there's another class of AI that actually is able to, the same kind of AI that powers autonomous vehicles today. It's actually it can actually power robotic as well, So that would be the fifth phase, right? Basically, it's actually letting these machines to execute essentially what we call the last mile, the delivery of the service, right? Whether it's a meal or food or some task that like cleaning a window, right? So maybe there will be so we're starting to seeing this already, like so different. You may be surprised that this sounds like far-fetched, in the future. But this is, in Asian countries, we have robotic waitstaff, robotic chef, robotic barista. I think in San Francisco we have some robotic baristas too. they make coffees for you, right? So they're so this is happening, right? And then the final phase is when the whole kind of lots of company, the majority of the company is starting to able to adopt this AI. Then we have I would say a AI augmented economy, basically, right? So that with that, I'm going to pause and let.
Can you elaborate a bit on the last, or you'll come back to this topic later on?
Sure. I mean, I could. I mean, the AI augmented economy is basically now that I would say that a large part of our work has been automated, right? Then there certainly is, I would say, a lot of fears that like, well, what do humans do, right? Well, I would say that until we get to the world where there's no problem anymore, right? There's always a role for human. Right? There's always a role for human because there's always new problem, there's unknown problem, there's more challenging, more difficult problem that people have never solved before, right? And so those problems, we have no data. We have no data to train the AI to how to mimic to mimic us how to respond in those situations, right? So basically, I would say that in this fully AI augmented economy, right? I mean, people will essentially do things that are actually more motivating, more challenging, right? And you solve the new problem or the once or twice or maybe several times, depending on how consistent these problems can be solved using the same method, right? So sometimes the same problem need to be solved several different times with different methodology, right? Then you would need to address them all, right? But it's to let the AI learn how you solve those problems, right? And then it can mimic you how to solve those problems, right? So, and then there has actually a lot of, I would say, economic effect as well, such as, universal basic income, right? So this is the greater, I would say, AI augmented economy. It could create so much efficiency that maybe a lot of us would not need to work. I mean, we have decreasing our work hour significantly since the Industrial Revolution, right? And it's steadily being decreased now. I mean, I think a lot of people right now, they don't really have to work 8 hours. They can actually make a, pretty, it's not very equally distributed among the population, but I think that there's when there's enough this automation, enough efficiency gain from AI and robotics, right? Maybe a lot more of us can work a lot less and focus on, I would say, things that are more important in our life, So that would be, I would say, the last phase in the AI augmented economy.
Thank you very much. I think there will be more discussion. I see already questions popping up in the Q&A. We wanted to get also to Hervé and ask your perspective on what we learned out of this crisis, but maybe then following up on what has been said with this perspective of sustainability and maybe how can we make this situation that we were, or what can we make of this situation and profit with the perspective of making processes sustainable and making this new economy sustainable?
Yeah, so what I would suggest to do is let's rewind time. Let's move to a time before COVID. So I can tell you before COVID, there was already the idea of a digital transformation happening. So the big companies like ours who deal with these water systems, we deal with cities, we deal with many industries. And basically we were moving before COVID to try to use and understand how to use best the digital tools. And what did that mean? It meant that in the past, in the 50s or 60s, engineers, what they love to do is to design in steady state. You know, give me how much maximum flow something is going to take or how much maximum chip, and then you design something according to something fixed, steady state. But you know that the world is never steady state. In fact, we are moving in a world which is less and less steady state. I used to live in North Carolina, and you could see these huge storms in North Carolina. How can I design, you know, something that is steady state where there is a fluctuation of plus or minus 1,000% in a short period of time? But I think what was happening before, and then I'm going to move to COVID, is we saw the huge possibility of this digital transformation to make systems more sustainable, more flexible, and so that's where we were moving technically. You know, basically instead of designing a huge central facility, the tendency was to move to decentralized facilities, more agile, and basically the image of that is what? It's internet. And we were discussing within the panel that internet has been so robust, and we were hoping to move to system very robust. And then, you know, there were people saying, hey, be careful, you know, we may receive a meteorite or there may be a virus. We had warnings, but suddenly, bang, COVID happened. And I think, so for me, and then I'll shift to more sustainability. When COVID happens, there is one thing that it does, it puts the human a lot more in front than we thought before. Because to make systems run, the big systems that, you know, there's still operators and things like that. So for us, COVID, the first thing it does, it puts humans more in the equation. It tells you human doesn't have to be necessarily on the plant, but somehow the interface between this fantastic AI and humans is going to be very important. And what is going to be very important is this idea of sustainability and the idea of resilience, because we will never guess what is going to hit us next, okay? But in the future, then I move to the future, can we use AI with things like digital twins to play scenarios? And so in our industry, this will become very important. So we want to be able for cities and for industries with them to play scenarios what if. Because you can imagine in the water and wastewater industry, first question is COVID in the wastewater? So you have many, many questions that you're bombarded with. And when you deal with that in the moment of the crisis, you don't do a good job. But if you could try to work with AI and then work in a world before the world, I think this could be fantastic. And we are trying to understand in my industry how we can play with that. But with a human AI interface as being very important.
Maybe this could be a question that we can open up to all of you in the panel. The thing that you just touched upon with the interaction between AI and humans, how would you say from your specific vantage points, did this relation between humans, the workers or managers change through the crisis, the interaction between humans and AI?
I think the first thing that I could see, and it's not so much AI, but the digital world, and that was mentioned before, is the fact that if that COVID crisis had happened before we had internet, what would have really happened? Because we have 50% or 60% more now, 80% of our people worked out of their home, and it was possible. So I think the main thing was that the ability, suddenly we realize the power of the ability to still work out of our homes. I think that was the biggest possibility. And then the big one for us is the interface between AI and the real world. So there is a revolution in AI, but there is a revolution also in biology, biotechnology. How are we going to be able to link the genomes and analysis on the genomes to some smart AI? So I think that is the future, but it will come later. But for us, yeah, we need to learn how we can analyze bugs. So and I'll stop there. There is a new part of technology which says if a population is sick, we should be able in a wastewater to see before even the doctors signs that the population is sick, because in the wastewater you find all the viruses, so I think we didn't see wastewater as data. Wastewater is data. Water is so much data. And so I think it changes our mind. We see things as data now, but we also should not forget the physical world. But I think that's yeah.
What do the others think, the change in the interaction between humans and AI through this crisis?
Yeah, I can jump in. I think there have been a couple of really interesting things. First of all, we saw with Zoom, there was a crash course in cybersecurity, right? So an awareness of where we were vulnerable, where AI and automation and bots could actually infiltrate and change how things are working. But I think along with that came almost a misplaced trust or lack of awareness, like that AI is happening. I think that a lot of people don't even realize how artificial intelligence is used in almost every facet of human resources, recruiting, hiring, selection, all of those things. And people don't know what are the proxies that are used. Why didn't I get this job? Why didn't I make it through the filter? There's this whole black box. And so that relationship hasn't been really built out or made more clear. And, especially when we talk about, taking the example of AI and HR, right? There's a huge reason to do it, right? Turnover is much, much more. 75% of the workforce is millennials. They turn over at 2.8 years, as opposed to the older folks who turned over at more 4 or 5 years, right? So we're seeing that there's a lot more hiring that has to happen, a lot of reasons to automate and make the practices better. And there's a lot of bias in the real world. So there's opportunities for AI to address that bias. But right now, the teams that are developing those tend not to be diverse teams. They tend not to test in different contexts. They don't necessarily understand or mitigate for the bias in the data sets. They don't understand the implications of the proxies that they're choosing. And so, Michael, to your point, we are going to train an intern, right? We're going to train an intern. We're going to get them to be good at this job. But who's overseeing that intern to make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to do, that they're not being corrupted by bad information, right? Or bad training. And so I think jobs, and HERVE, you as well, these trends were already happening, right? They've just been accelerated. So rather than deleting jobs, we're really augmenting or changing the jobs. And part of that has to be this oversight for the AI and asking these questions, who is helped, who is harmed, what are the unintended consequences, how do we mitigate for that? How do we create feedback cycles so we know that there is even a problem?
Yeah, precisely. Maybe I could comment on that a little bit. I think there's a lot of concern around this black box nature of these AI or deep learning networks. I think that's changing though. I mean, I think there's an increasing need. Specifically even in my company. Like when we so as I mentioned before, PROS is a company that help company to optimize prices, or we help a lot of the airlines and lots of B2B company optimize their pricing and sales effectiveness. Right. So when you recommend a price, right? A lot of people may say that, well, why do you recommend this price? I used to sell it at like much lower price. You tell me that to increase my price at 50%. That's pretty scary. I may not want to do that, right? I mean, I may lose my customer, right? I mean, so you have to offer explanation, right? So explainability becomes very, very crucial in this world. I think especially when you are in the finance industry. Especially also in HR, right? When you didn't get a job, you should offer a reason why you didn't get a job, right? Or not just like, hey, my neural network tell me that you're not qualified, right? That's not gonna fly, right? So this is actually changing. So our team is actually developing an explainable a model of these deep neural networks. Right? You train it first, right? First, you have to have the black box, right? And then you have another system, right, that goes on top of it to explain the inner workings of this black box, right? And I think there's a misconception between the black box nature. I think it's not that the black box is not explainable. It's just that it has millions of parameters. It's just very hard for us to understand what it's actually doing, right? It can tell you that it's because of this path and this neuron gets activated and all that, right? So when you make a decision, right, you don't go trace like what's going on in every single neuron in your brain to come up with that conclusion, right? We don't do that. We look at it at a more high level from a top down, right, and to explain what's happening. So this is the approach that we're taking to address this black box. We actually have a separate model that go on to analyze the network, the deep neural network, to understand what's actually going on, to give us some high level understanding, right? In which we can actually go deeper and deeper, right? Eventually, we could dig it as deep as each single neuron, but at that time, at that level, it would be very, very hard to understand what's going on. But we could stop at any level we want, right? So that's the idea of this.
Basically, what you're saying. Oh, sorry. Basically, what you're saying is that for you, from the perspective of more like the engineers and the companies that provide AI, the crisis might have just accentuated the fact that it is a lot the user interface that counts, the user experience that is important. So where you might have been thinking more black box from your perspective, we get a lot of questions around this topic, and maybe Philippe can also comment on this question, is about like, how do we do it? Where do I start my AI implementation and so on? It seems that it resonates with your perspective coming from the engineering side, where we can do almost anything, but we realize that if we really want to implement it, it is about the interface. We need to create very good connections and touch points, the interfaces, the way the person in the company uses the AI, basically not the machine, but the levers, the buttons, basically.
And by the way, the role of the managers will be more and more complex, because on one side, the machine, the black box is still there, and you've got to explain the output of the black box, which is a very challenging topic. Philippe, what are your thoughts about the role and the impact on the manager's side?
Well, I think there would be opportunities and challenges. My point of view is about the evolution of the organization. If we take a short-term, medium-term, long-term perspective, in the short term, which is happening now, everybody's wondering, should I come back to work? As you were saying, some people don't want to come back to work. How do I've got further mass adoption of all those communication tools, collaborative tools? And that's what is happening on the short term. And it brings, much more knowledge, intelligence to the worker, with all the downside that we mentioned before. Then that digitalization is going to drive further into refining in the medium term what is the core of my company, what is non-core anymore. And therefore, we're going to enter much more in the virtual workforce for which digitalization is going to be key, and bringing them a context of decision-making is going to be absolutely fundamental. And as AI is progressing, as algorithm kept on learning, is what Michael was mentioning, is what part of the human job AI is going to take. And in terms of job content evolution, we're going to move much more from being problem solvers to problem finders, and entering more and more in the unknown, having AI around us, helping us to do that. So, if you take it from a management perspective, of course, that's going to change a lot of things. You don't manage a neuronal network the same way as you manage a pyramidal organization, with people coming in and out according to their skills, according to the project to be done. The relationship of a virtual workforce with a company will be different. How, as a manager, you bring the meaning, therefore the motivation, so that you keep the same level of output as you do on a physical presence to manage the people. And the other point, as a manager, as we all noticed, and I said in the introduction, we're going faster, we work more, everybody is back to back in terms of meetings. How do you find hygiene in the workplace and making sure that your collaborators are sustainable in terms of delivering what they have to be done and work in the right work-life balance, which for a lot of people has been lost. Yeah. What I would add to that is, in this world in which we are entering, we're going to become more and more skill specific. And therefore, there would be more and more need to be trained, to be retrained, to make sure that what is delivered to the company is really the most updated knowledge which the company is needed. And continuous learning will be a fundamental aspect that managers, company, we need to foster in consortium, probably with academy, with schools which are popping up everywhere, which are able constantly to upskill, reskill workforce and giving them as well the opportunity to apply to become relevant. So that becomes like a more society debate, a governmental debate on how to address this transition, because, well, we all know that there will be a lot of job destruction, but as well a lot of job creation. And the key point is how fast we are making the transition and how well is it managed.
It's very interesting because as educators, we have this aha moment in the recent years, which is our students are not competing, and that's young students as well as professional learners, lifelong learners, are not today only competing against other people that are studying. They're competing against machines for certain jobs now and will so more and more. And what you just said resonates very well with a lot of questions we are getting. And I was wondering, just piggybacking on this, people are asking for like concrete examples. Would maybe every one of you, would you be able to give like one example each or from your experience? I mean, there's so many that we can't cover everything, but maybe for our audience, it would be interesting from each one of you to have one example of this is how AI was implemented and this is how it affected the job in the way you saw it happening.
And so if I may add one element to your question, can we focus on some industries? Because what we are talking about is very generic. And actually, it might be different if we are talking about industry, if we are talking about services, if we are talking about white collars or blue collars, and so on. So if you can give examples per industry of this digital transformation, which is being, of course, accelerated by COVID, it will highlight and bring value, I guess, to the audience. Who wants to jump in?
Well, if you want, I can give you some examples on the wastewater treatment plants and how AI is implemented. So, like I said before, wastewater treatment plant is an asset, and then it was receiving rain, so different quantities of water. It didn't know that, and then the output hopefully was meeting environmental standards. Now, with digital tools and AI, what's happening? There is a lot of information from the weather channel. So now a wastewater treatment plant is connected to the weather channel. The data from the weather channel is used to predict in advance that the rain event is going to come and affect the catchment basin of that wastewater treatment plant. Immediately, some valves are starting to actuate, and some areas of the network are already being planned to be storage areas to minimize the water impact of what is coming to your plant. So a message is being sent to the operator who is home watching the voice. And basically he's seeing a message, hey, there is rain coming, already valves B and C are being closed. Please know that we may have a problem, so be aware and be ready for that time to come to that wastewater treatment plant. And then, you have more sensors on the plant. When the event happens, basically we follow that much better. So, and then that is all stored in a database, data, and that data is available for AI algorithms to be able to analyze, hey, how was the plant able to cope and what was wrong, so the next time it's done a bit better. So actually the physical systems are starting to use, now it's not perfect today. In fact, what we are missing, I would say, in that is probably better sensors. because the eyes and ears of AI remain, I think, probably one of the limiting, and they will be more and more the limiting factor. We need better sensors, smarter sensors.
So how did that, I don't know, in this example, are you able to say that it impacted certain jobs, and did you create new jobs, or did it impact jobs where people were basically being let go because they were not necessary anymore? What was kind of the impact on the current people working there in the workforce?
Yeah, I think you probably, we haven't done that full analysis now, because these plants I described are not your mainstream plants. They are right now demonstration plants. You know, they are what can be done plants for big cities. So, but I think it destroys a few jobs that were there before. The people always, you know, supposed to be on guard or available for now. They are less needed because we can anticipate a bit more, and so that is changed. The people have to be more skilled because they have to be able to use the interface, you know, between the advanced control. And so the skills are better. You need more skilled people, a bit less people in some areas. We really don't know. We really don't know the answer to that question. But like you said, we think it will destroy some jobs, create some new jobs, and we are just people right now are not afraid, because we know that we needed the plant to work better. And we know that will make the plant better, faster, cheaper. So overall, for that example, I think it's going to be good. It's going to have a positive impact, even in terms of people and jobs. No. Yeah.
Anyone else? Concrete examples?
If I can add to that, we need to bring the debate in the level of maturity in which we are. So we talk about AI, but many industries are still in the descriptive analytics, which is having the data on time on what happened yesterday, not tomorrow. The data cleanness is still an issue in terms of predicting what will happen tomorrow, and even prescriptive for a lot of industry is still science fiction. So when you are at proof of concept, at pilots, there are many things you can predict. You can predict in a factory where and when an accident will happen, because the weak signals preceding an accident are always the same. You can predict which parts will arrive on your manufacturing line late, depending on the interaction, number of calls you get to your suppliers, engineering changes that you brought. All of that is creating some noises, which ultimately create a delay. You can predict which parts will arrive with a bad quality. So there are so many things you can predict and do a pilot on that, but 90% of the job is about cleaning data to ultimately get a pilot which has a life shelf, which is very short, 6 months, because every time you replay the feature and you need to reprogram. So, I mean, these are a few concrete examples, but when we talk about AI, and I really give an industry perspective, today everybody is about getting to the right level to get just descriptive analytics, you know, and getting it right, and having the right master data management, which tomorrow will allow to bring at scale the solutions that we are talking here.
I would like to +1 on that for Philippe in terms of data and getting the right data, setting the right requirements for the data. Is the data clean? Is the data accurate? Have you mitigated for the bias in the data? And so I'm going to give the counter example rather than how people are using this. But if you are going to think about using HR and AI, are you building it in-house? Do you have a diverse team? If you're building it out of house, if you're licensing a solution, have you asked those companies about how they're mitigating for bias, what tests they're doing, how they're auditing their AI? And that's really, really key, because they don't have a financial incentive necessarily to do the extra work. But if you as the client ask for it, you will. And the counter example I wanted to bring up is that companies, and this is a great thing, companies are aware of the shortfallings of AI. So recently, I think you probably saw IBM, Amazon, and Microsoft basically upended their facial recognition because they realized that it wasn't ready, it was causing more harm, it needed more work, and we need companies to be transparent about these things where it's not working so that we can improve and make things better. And, even at Berkeley, we're seeing almost a shift the other way where some schools are using software to pick admissions. Berkeley's not. Where we used to rely on SAT and ACT scores, we're no longer going to consider those because they're a better predictor of wealth than they are of performance in school. And so it's a really interesting time where we have to look at, what are the proxies that we're using in AI, and are those good proxies? We should be questioning those gold standards. Are they actually doing what they're supposed to do?
Maybe I comment on a couple of things. I think in terms of job disruption, I would say that, AI is actually no different than any technology. I think in the short term, it will always disrupt some jobs, or displace completely some jobs. But in the longer term, I would say that it will create other jobs as well. I think that's true of any technology that we invented, throughout the course of human history. I think the effect of AI may be a little more dramatic, and some people said that, this is like the Industrial Revolution, the fourth Industrial Revolution or something like that. But and the reason is because, this AI is applicable pretty much everywhere. It's like the electricity or steam engine in the first two Industrial Revolution. In these mechanical machines, they can be applied everywhere. So it changes the way we work very, very dramatically. Lots of jobs are being where labor is required is disrupted. Agriculture, manufacture, all these things that require human labor have been disrupted, right? So now, when you have, rather than a mechanical machine, you have an intelligent machine, right? Now, a lot of these analytical jobs that require a lot of data processing, right, and decision making, those jobs may be disrupted, regardless of which industry you're in, right? So I think that's the fear because it's so versatile, right? So, but I would say that, yes, in the transition phase, there will be some job disruption. And I think this, we have to make plans and execute strategy to how do we kind of transition in a more smooth way, right? Rather than just have this disruption and just, okay, too bad, you're the collateral damage, right? And we can't do that. I mean, so I think there are tactics or strategy that's being implemented. For example, like the gain that you get, the efficiency gain or the monetary gain, the financial gain that you get from AI, part of that should be reused to train and upskill your employees so that they can move on to something else, right? That's a good use. I would say that, a good use of the resource that you gain, right? So that you preserve the capacity to use those your employee in a different way, right? Jobs will be displaced. Some job will no longer exist in the near future, right? But what do they do? I mean, if you don't reskill them, retrain them to something else, right? Then that's a danger, right? So using the monetary, the gain to educate these people and retrain them, I think it's a good strategy moving forward. So I think in terms of I would say, overseeing AI and make sure it's doing what it's supposed to do. As I mentioned before, this is something that's changing, right? We have to, again, this is also, I would say, a transition phase. In this transition phase, there will be a lot of black box type of AI that's not interpretable. That's very hard to, it's not, I would say, not interpretable. It's possible, but very hard for human to make sense of it, right? But this is changing. Like, as I mentioned, like our team is actually developing explainable neural network, these type of technology is starting to come up, and they will become more and more prevalent. And and I think that this will change the way we look at AI, in the sense that now you can actually understand it, what it's actually doing, right, at the high level, and in a way that we can understand, right? So you didn't get this job because you have this factor, or you get drunk or whatever. So something like these, they'll be able to explain it, right? And you could decide whether you want, if it's not working, right? So the second thing is that, like, I think one thing that's really, really important in moving along this maturity curve that I mentioned, this 6-phase maturity curve, is the collection of feedback data, right? So what's working, what you have to know, the machine has to know, right? Not only you have to, the machine also needs to know what's actually working and what is not working, right? So these outcome-based feedback data need to be fed back as input to these algorithms so that they could tune themselves, right? And you as we as a human, right? A supervisor will have to oversee that and see how it's actually leveraging these feedback data to retune the model, right? So yeah, I could go on a lot.
Thank you, Michael. Very linked to what you are pointing out. Change management is a key topic. How do you explain change? How do you secure your employees? HERVE is a large organization, a global organization, just like VEOLIA. How do you make sure that your employees are part of the game and will be part of the game for this transition we are talking about?
Yes, so there's actually a strategy, what we call adoption strategy for AI. And I think that's, I would say that, the sooner we move to this kind of, in this transition phase, right? As you go from one phase to the next, or during this entire maturity curve of the AI adoption maturity curve, this entire 6th phase could be, think of it as a big transition as well, right? There will always be some disruption, right? But once we get to that, AI augmented economy, right? Then things start to kind of, I would say level itself out, one of the side effects maybe people just work less, and enjoy life more, right? And a lot of things get automated, and people, I would say, will pursue things that they like to do, not because they have to do it. So people will only work on things that they want to work on, right? It's a little bit kind of futuristic, but I think that's possible. So what is this adoption strategy, right? So if you have this adoption strategy to move along this maturity curve faster, I think it's better for everyone. So this one adoption strategy that I talk a lot about with the company that I work with is this, again, this is a 3-phase adoption strategy. One is that you never roll out this AI to the entire company. You roll it out to a small kind of pilot team, okay? You roll it out and you roll it out, I would say, almost in secret. Okay, nobody knows about it, right? And then, there's many good reasons for that, because AI, it's I would say, no deployment of any technology is ever 100% smooth and perfect, right? There will always be some kinks and that you have to iron out, and so you work out all those kinks and with this pilot group, and one of the important thing is the selection of this pilot group, So within a company, there will always be people who say, like, no, I'm not going to deal with AI. It's going to replace my job. I'm not going to. So, but there are always going to be some people who's going to be say, hey, these are cool technology. There will always be people who are, I would say, wanted to experiment, wanted to try new things. So you select your pilot group by picking the most. You almost design for success. Okay. You design.
Michael, I wonder if we all have the same point of view, because. On this part of the world, especially in Europe, the social dialogue is key. And I would like to have the input of Philippe and Hervé about how do we manage this transition, which is key in a complex environment just like ours, where we need definitely to have a dialogue with the trade unions, with all the players and so on. Hervé or Philippe, what's your feedback to that?
For me,
sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Philippe. Go ahead.
Okay. You're going to find, the traditional elements of the playbook of transformation. You need a strong vision, but people understand, are aligned. You need the change story to back it up. You need to size the impact. And, well, my view from Europe, it's transparency is key on that. Ideally, if the right strategy of upskilling, reskilling, that's an element of a change employability. These are elements of a change story which really can reassure everybody in that change. And then you develop your solution. So, your agile approach to it, and step by step, it's a test and learn constantly and grow your solutions around that, because, there's really a learning path on implementing AI. And what is important is constantly keeping the pulse on the organization, making sure they have the ability to renew for renewal. But that's key, fundamental, because we're going to change the nature of their job. Are they continuously trained with the right hypercare to make sure that they can work in this new environment. So what I'm saying, I mean, you would find it in most transformation. What is going to change on AI is a part of the unknown in which we are entering, because the vision can be very strong, but we know that on the way, the way we will develop the application could change, which is part of the new technologies being implemented in companies.
Yeah, so for us, the short answer is really we don't know, but I think the things that are happening will be training, because you are AI knowledgeable people, but you can imagine that in companies, the first thing is you read AI, okay, but the first thing is training, understanding. So the big groups, what they will do typically, they will go to consultants specialized in AI, and then with these consultants, they will do what you mentioned, Michael, which is to try to set up small examples or pilots of what that looks like. And I think, Jean-Michel, like you, it's going to be very different in France than it is in the US, simply because our cultures are so different. And I think we will be challenged in our culture because we're a culture with less responsibilization of people. We are more hierarchical. So I think that may be an interesting twist. But I think what will happen is we will learn. We will do pilots, like you mentioned, Michael, and slowly with that understand. But we will have to deal with you're right, with the CSOs or with the unions and with the people. But yeah.
I'd just like to add, from the perspective of reskilling and retraining, I think this is across the board. We need to have learning organizations because the pace of change is not going to slow down. We need to have people who are agile and able to change. And this goes double for the leadership. So when we talk about retraining leadership, we're talking about people who know how to build psychological security and trust in teams, right? Team building. Because Michael, if you're going to get feedback from people as well as from the system itself, they have to feel like they can give you negative feedback, right? Like this isn't working or here's this problem. And so that idea of emotional intelligence, being able to really understand what it takes to enable your workforce to be optimized, to transition, to understand what it takes to reskill people and see their potential. How do you do reviews and evaluations that are focused on very concrete actions for, here's a potential career path for you. Here's a next step. Here's the area where you could build your skills and then you would be qualified for this job. So again, there are really positive opportunities for AI to inform and kind of give people more opportunities to advance in their career. But that's going to rely on having a pretty competent leadership team that understands and sees the potential in their employees and knows how to transition, how to do change management, how to work with people to make this learning environment part of how the company does business.
Jill, if I can react a bit, Jill, to this topic. I recall what you said at the beginning of this discussion. All of us are not equal versus the transformation phase we are facing. So how do we address this topic? You mentioned at the beginning we are not equal. At the same time, you want the organization to take everybody on board for the next move?
Yeah, actually, maybe even with the concrete example of a question that pointed out the extreme case of people that might have handicaps. And that really is a strong example on top of the examples you gave that were hit hard by the COVID situation. And if the general idea is we move more into digitalization, it's an extreme example of potentially people being left behind.
Right. So it's going to require intentionality, right? We actually have to be looking in more places. You can't rely on referrals. You can't rely on the channels of hiring that you've used before. And so when we talk about intentionality, it's across the board, understanding how we write job descriptions. I saw there was another question in the chat about what tools are out there, right, to make more equitable hiring. So there's a company called Textio that will actually look at your job description descriptions for gendered language, or you can look at them just for yourself and see what are extraneous requirements that aren't actually part of the job, that's just sort of a copy and paste from another job. There are lots of things we can do to be more intentional about the recruiting phase. And then for the advancement phase, as I was kind of alluding to earlier, it's about removing the gray areas where unconscious bias can creep in. It's about being intentional about the evaluation structure. So what are your actual responsibilities and what is constructive feedback on how to improve for those specific skills? Or if you want to go into another field or retrained, what skills that you need. And traditionally and especially women of color will get less constructive advice. They'll get subjective personality feedback. And so this is where we talk about making systemic changes. So we get better leadership, but then we have to make our systems align the rewards and advancement with those. So if we really do care about having effective communication, collaboration, critical thinking, problem solving skills, then that has to be part of the evaluation that we look at, not just how many widgets did you sell. And so I think there's a lot of things that we can do structurally around the systems of HR to make the systems more fair and just equitable. And then, coming back to the AI, I think there's a lot to think about in terms of making sure that the technologies that we develop, the technologies that we employ work equally for everyone. So I think those are key factors. And, there is opportunity for avoiding some of the biases that are out there in terms of, when people look at resumes, they look at the college you went to and they look for the big names, or they know certain areas that people are from. These are all forms of hidden unconscious bias. So I think we have an opportunity to anonymize and show people the skills that they have. There's actually a number of tools that will allow you to do testing, right? Computer skills testing or different things like that, where the people evaluating don't know the gender or ethnicity of the person applying for the position. So it's exciting, right? Because there are a lot of efforts being made in this way, and we just need to make sure that we're auditing and checking to make sure they work as intended.
I wanted to, we're slowly coming up on time. I wanted to summarize, I think, a few of the questions from the audience that resonate with what you were just describing. It seems to me one of the overarching topics that we have been discussing through this was this differentiation between effectiveness and efficiency. And the effectiveness has, like an effective organization, has more of the human component, is more focused on the humans, and has the key advantage of being more resilient. There is still this efficiency perspective to it. And so the question is, given potentially, geographical limitations that are imposed on organizations through policy in Europe versus United States, or even other countries in the world, wouldn't you say that there is a risk of an economic divide, not just between companies that are more or less automated, but also start an economic divide with economies where you can just like full on out go for efficiency? So you could imagine a company that just goes like, we're going to lay off everyone, replaced with AI, and we're going to lay off the other people as well if they're not already trained with AI or data technology, and just hire new people that are trained in data. And we're going fully on efficiency, and we will therefore be the most cost-effective company versus other companies that say, no, we go for effectiveness, resiliency, and we stick with the human factor. How would you react to those two scenarios?
I think as always, the truthful. Sorry, go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I personally don't think it has to be either way, right? I mean, I think companies have, we've been trained to optimize certain things, right? But I think we're very good at optimizing, but we do I would say, a pretty bad job at balancing. Okay, so I think, what does balancing mean? Balancing really means that, you don't just optimize for a handful, like 4 or 5 or 10 different metrics. Rather, you simultaneously optimize for, I would say, hundreds or maybe potentially thousands of different metrics, right? And that's very, very hard, right? I think that's not easy, right? I mean, I think that's a mental shift, right? Rather than, optimizing for just a few things, right? You need to balance among all these different constraints, right? I mean, one of the reasons I think we get ourselves in this situation of highly interdependence in this supply chain is because companies are optimizing for cost saving, right? For profit, right? But what about if you actually look at other things that we can optimize, for example, environmental impact and all this stuff, you may not actually choose to do certain business with certain region because they don't have a strict enough environmental protection, environmental law or labor protection, right? So there are many other dimensions that you need to optimize, and which means requires you need to really balance them all. So.
I think it's a very interesting and very complex point, but very important, effectiveness. In our case, we have a CEO who is always mentioning raison d'être, the reason for being. So saying that we are not only there to make money. Now it's a communication, it's a company structure, but I think there is something in it, and I think because the human element could change. I mean, companies then what AI may do, it will enable individual people to do things where if companies are only looking at effectiveness, they will lose some of these people. The opposite. If they are looking at efficiency, they will lose the people with a broader, and you have more and more young people with a very broad thing who say, we have fantastic people joining our industry, which were not joining our industry 50 years ago, simply because they say, we want to work on green things. And these people may not accept companies, that are only looking at efficiency. You may lose some of your best people. So it's a complex thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I mentioned earlier, 75% of the employees are millennials, and millennials care about sustainability, right? They care about equitable participation, right? These are things, if you want to recruit the top talent, you're going to need to address. But it's not just coming from the bottom up, it's coming from the top down. I just posted in the chat, the Business Roundtable redefined what it meant to be a successful company, that it's not just the stakeholders, it's multiple stakeholders. And what do you play in the community? And so this larger idea of, what was originally like the B Corporation, the for benefit corporation, the triple bottom line, like these things are coming back in a form that makes it part of how you do business.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think that we're coming up on time. Maybe just from each one of you, like a parting comment to the question, what would you suggest to each one of our listeners? What can they do so that they can make sure they didn't waste the opportunity of this crisis from your perspective?
I'll jump in since I just was talking. I think this is our big opportunity to co-create a new normal. The idea of going back to the way things were is just not going to happen. These changes, to the point of Philippe and Michael, were already afoot, right? They were already happening. Sustainability is becoming a more critical issue, as Hervé said. These are things that are not going to go back to. There is no going back. So that means we need to think very intentionally and consciously, what does it mean to create a new normal that is more equitable, that is more inclusive, that is more sustainable, that is more efficient, right? Like all of these come around to this issue of AI because efficiency and sustainability can be fueled by these different technologies. So let's go create a new normal.
Well, I would talk on the same way. It's really the moment to reinvent your career path, reinvent the workplace, even reinvent society. That's where we are. We all realize how far we've been on good ways and bad ways, and it's a unique opportunity to make a shift.
Yeah, I would say for me, in my life, the human element is so important. It will always be there. So if we are messed up, whatever comes will be messed up. I mean, at the end of the day, for me, it's education. So the only thing I would say, educate yourself about AI, because AI is going to be very important. It's coming. Educate your children, and as a society, make sure that this education is going to be equal. Because if things are not equal, again, so it could be AI, anything, things are not going to work. If access to AI is going to be limited to a few people, then it's going to be tough again.
I would say that, to not waste this opportunity is to try something new. I mean, I would just say that, I think a lot of people are afraid to try new things because it impacts the top line, the bottom line, right? I think this, but the top line, bottom line is disrupted anyway right now. So you might as well try something, right? And to make a, create a new normal, create a better normal, right? So.
Thank you very much. Thank you all to all our speakers. I will let Jean-Michel make the closing remarks.
I'm just very pleased about the discussion we just had, because we all know that it's a very complex situation we are facing, and that we need to have amazingly new prepared managers for the future. They need to be techies, they need to have a vision, they need to be sustainable, they need to be leaders and thoughtful and so on. So that's why it's always very interesting to be part of this type of discussion, making the links between California and Europe, because we share the same concerns and we have the same, we are facing more or less the same issues, and we are still looking for how do we make our next move. So this is the aim of this type of panel, this type of discussion. We cooperate, and we are very pleased to have this cooperation with Berkeley Extension and CNAM on the European side. And we look forward for the next session. I definitely want to thank the preparation team. I want to thank, of course, our panelists, because you brought your different perspective, and I guess we are very pleased about this discussion. And of course, I want to thank the audience. Something like 400 people were attending this session. This is just great, and I hope that we will have a very fascinating session in the near future. So we will communicate very quickly and very briefly about the next panel, but thank you for your time, and thank you for participating to this session. So bye-bye from Paris, and good day in California, isn't it? Take good care.
Thank you all.
Thank you all. And take good care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.